Hello there. I live where it snows, and I picked up this cool GNU Money board for this season. I'm pretty excited about it. It's got a hybrid profile, so it's rocker in the center, and then it's elliptical camber on the tip and on the tail. It's symmetrical. But I also live on the East Coast, which means we ride in ice every time we go riding. It's got this magnetraction system along the side that has multiple radius cuts. It's kind of serrated like a knife, so it digs in. But if we were to model this geometry, it wanders all over the place in 3D space. How do we work with shapes that almost have no reference at all? That's what we're going to take a look at in today's episode. I'm Jesse, and these are some solid ideas. Let's hit the slopes.
Well, hit the slopes indeed. This geometry has slopes and curves that go all over the place. So our challenge is going to be to stitch them together. Now, we've got a couple of different profiles that we can look at, and I've sort of exaggerated these because the resulting geometry doesn't really matter. I don't suspect that most of you are modeling snowboards on a regular basis. If you are, that's pretty cool though. So I've exaggerated them just so we can see a little bit better what it is we're doing here. So for example, I've taken these cutouts and I've made them quite a bit deeper than they are on the actual board. And this shape here I kind of took from a reference on their website, and you can kind of see what I was talking about with that curve. That's obviously much more exaggerated than what it is on the real snowboard. But you can see what I was referring to here, where the rocker shape starts with the middle being kind of a teetering point, and then the rest of the board sort of comes up off of the ground like this. Obviously not this exaggerated. So we need to figure out how to get these two shapes together. The assumption that we're making here in this case is that this profile will go out flat. So we're assuming that the bottom of the board is flat. But if this were, curved or arced on the bottom, then you might have to take a little bit of a different approach here. But the outer edge is really the interesting one, because this shape has to follow the shape of the board and then all of these cutouts. So this wanders quite a bit in 3D space, but then that also has to map to this side profile shape as well. And that's kind of the trick of this. So let's take these two images, we'll bring them into SOLIDWORKS, we'll use these as reference, and we'll model around these. We'll move this off to the side, and the first thing that we'll do is go to our right plane and we'll create a sketch here. And I'm going to use a reference line, so we'll go with a center line and we'll start marking off our reference here. We'll make a line at the bottom. I'm going to use the click method because I think I'm actually going to do a box here. That might be a little bit easier for us to track, because the middle of the bottom touches the ground and then the sides kind of go off in this mustache-like shape. It's going to be a little bit hard to track down here, I think. So I'm going to make this sort of big reference, and I'll select the bottom, and we can grab this, this dimension that we have here, and we'll make this the overall length of the board. In my case, this is 154 centimeters, so I'll just type in cm to convert this. And we'll select this bottom line and the origin, and we'll make this midpoint. All right, so now we've got a true to size reference that is kind of sitting here, and we've got this bounds to work with. This overall height doesn't really matter. I just need this kind of these end goalposts here that I can use as a reference for where those tips are going to land. So let's bring in the sketch image. So I'll use my S key and I'll start typing in picture, sketch picture. Now you can also access this tool from tools, sketch tools, and sketch picture. All right. And we'll load in our side profile here. Now, once you load in an image, SOLIDWORKS is just telling us this is a high-res image. I'm going to say okay to that. That's fine. I'll accept the extra detail here because we've only got a couple images, but do be aware if you're loading a lot of images, you may want to reduce that. We've got a couple different ways that we can scale this image once we get it in, and you'll see that this Enable Scale tool is turned on by default once it comes in. This you can use to go from reference point to another, so you can drag and drop this. So if I go from one side to the other, say to here, then this will come up with a dimension dialog, and I can do the same thing, and that will scale that image for me. Or if you want to take your time a little bit, you can uncheck that or leave it turned on, and you can line this up with a reference. Now I have a tendency to do it this way because I'm usually trying to be a little bit more exact, but if you feel like you can be accurate with that method with the scale tool, it's a lot faster. All right, so let's get this lined up, and we'll kind of line this up into our reference that we've built for ourselves here. Now this should be pretty close already because we just did that drag and drop. So let's, maybe we'll shrink this down a little bit here. just to make this fit the bounds. Now, when you're looking for images, this might not be an ideal type of image because we've got this fairly thick, over-exaggerated image that has this round sort of edge on the side that I just kind of duplicated from their website. So we don't really have this defined edge. Now, again, this geometry doesn't really matter. So this will be fine for our purposes. But if you are looking for images, you might want to find something that's a little more crisp or direct in giving you a shape that you need to duplicate or do some measurements, right? So we'll say that's good enough for what we need. We'll say okay, and we've got this image now set in here to the overall real scale in SOLIDWORKS. So we can exit our sketch now. I'll use my D key to bring my confirmation corner to my cursor. We'll exit sketch, and then in the tree, I'm just going to rename this to side profile. Now, I like to rename my sketches, particularly when I've got images in here, because I have a tendency to turn them on and off when I'm using them for reference. So I always put my images in their own sketch if I can kind of leave them off to the side, and then I can toggle them on and off and name them so I can find them quickly or search for them. So now that we've got this in here, we've got an overall length to work with. Let's go to our top plane and we'll put in the other profile. So we'll do the same thing we did before. We'll add in a picture, say okay. We will select, say yep, keep our resolution the way that it is. And again, we'll do the same thing. So we'll turn off our scale tool and shrink this down a little bit and get this aligned, okay? Now, I made these images, so I have put kind of a reference for myself down the middle just to make my life a little bit easier. So I've got this kind of marked off here towards the center so I can make things a little bit easier. But if you don't have that, or if you're using some reference that you got somewhere else, you just have to go back and forth a little bit and try to get things laid in place. And that looks relatively close. Again, your accuracy with this is just dependent upon what you actually need from this geometry. Okay, so that looks close enough for what it is we need it for. So we'll say okay on that. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to exit my sketch and we'll rename this. Again, I like to have these in immediately as well, because then you just got them right at the top. They're named, they're easy to find. You can toggle them on and off and come back to them whenever you need. Now we can go ahead and start creating some geometry here. And already we can sort of get some idea of how these two things need to combine. If we kind of look at this and spin them around, we see, okay, we can sort of get that eyeball visual. Now this board is a symmetrical board, which means that the profile is the same front to back, nose to tail on both sides. So we can actually do this in a quarter and then mirror it. So that's what I'm going to do. First things first, let's go and we'll copy the side profile shape. Then we'll do the top profile and we'll figure out how we're going to combine them together. So I'm going to create another sketch on my right plane. And from here, we're going to match this shape. Now, this is kind of a strange, interesting shape, and we're going to do this with a style spline. Now, splines can be a topic for a whole nother video. This video isn't intended to focus on splines. I love splines. So if you want to know more information on splines, let me know in the comments. Maybe that is a good topic for a future, but we're just going to make use of one here. And I'm actually going to do something different on the other one just to give you a little bit of variety here. But let's start this off with a style spline in this case, which is a relatively new version of the spline tool. So we'll grab our style spline, and the style spline, the way that this works is basically you can think of this as like drawing your control polygon. So you're drawing the shape that the spline would naturally find its shape through. So like a best fit curve, you're drawing the points that the spline would then work through. So for example, here we can take this from the center, we can go straight out. So that's kind of setting our tangency at the bottom. And then this will come up to bend that arc up, and then we'll come back down again to curl that arc. So if it was, you know, finding its fit through that arc, it would do something like that. All right. Now, the great thing with splines is you can use pretty few points to get things in place and into a complex curve. And in order to do that, we can massage around the points that we just drew in order to make this shape fit. So we'll move this around a little bit. We'll make sure that that stays horizontal. And let's move our point up a little bit. Again, this is where it gets somewhat vague with our shape here, because this is sort of rounded, but we'll say this point right in the middle, we can even lock that to the center if we wanted to do that. And we'll get that in place. Okay, so that looks close enough for what we need to do. Again, the actual geometry here is sort of irrelevant. This is just an example. But we'll say that that is close enough. Now, the nice thing with the Style Spline is you can go ahead and start adding dimensions or relations to this curve that you've drawn that is then producing the actual spline itself. I'm not going to bother with that because we don't need to lock this down, but the Style Spline is absolutely great for that. We'll say okay to that and we'll use this just as a reference. Okay, so we've got that. Now, what do we do with this top shape? This top shape is a little bit complicated in the sense that if we look at this straight on, we've got multiple shapes. There's sort of we've got a flat-ish, arc here that's pretty flat, but then it turns into a steeper arc that then kind of curls back around, and then we've got cutouts from there as well. However, we also notice that this whole thing is rounded, so we have to try to sort that out as well. Now, my argument here, and again, just to show you something different, is going to be that if you want to work with spline geometry, but you're not comfortable with the spline tools yet, and if you aren't, I would encourage you to get comfortable with them because they're very useful. You can actually make spline geometry from non-spline geometry. So that's what we're going to take a look at here. Let's go ahead and we'll start this profile. Again, I'm going to start this on a new sketch. So we'll do a new sketch on our top plane. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to make some references. We'll use this, this sketch shape. So we'll create this whole corner of it. And then we'll do that mirroring after the fact. So I'll use my S key and we'll grab the line tool. And we're just going to come down from here somewhere where that virtual sharp would be. And we'll come up towards the top to here and over. Now, this one that I've come over might be baffling to you. I'm going to set this one to construction geometry. And the reason why I've put that line there is because I'm going to use that as a reference for this top arc. Because this top arc is fairly slight, and in fact, if this was any radius at all, I want to make sure that when we mirror this over to the other side, we don't have any weird peaks here. So this would need to be tangent at this point to the horizontal, and I just like having a nice visual that I can see that from. So let's go ahead and we'll put these arcs in. Again, I mentioned that we're going to create this as one giant single entity, but we'll create it in little digestible chunks first. So we'll break this down into simpler geometry, and to do that, I'll use my 3-point arc. And we'll take our 3-point arc here and we'll put this again out to that virtual sharp-ish. And I'll get that arc in place. And while I'm right here, I'm going to select these two entities just using my control key, and we'll make these tangent. All right, once those are tangent, I can get that back in place, and that is about where that needs to go. Okay, now from here, we can start working on the lower section. So I'm going to use another arc that looks like this is pretty consistent in radius down to maybe like here. So we'll grab my S key and we'll grab a 3-point arc again. We'll go from here down to maybe there and see if we can get that in place. That's pretty close. And then we're going to do the same thing down here. This is going to go from here down to the bottom, and that kind of reverses its direction. And I'm just going to go right out to the peaks there. And then this, we're going to move in place, and we'll make sure that that is tangent as well. Okay, that is looking pretty good. Now, these are just 3-point arcs that we could easily define with dimensions. I'm not going to bother to do that here because, again, that's not the point. But we've got these locked in. We can define these very quickly. Now, the interesting thing is going to be cutting these little scallops out and then turning this into one big entity that we can make use of, right? So let's go ahead and we'll put these scallops in here. And to do that, again, I'm going to make use of 3-point arcs. And then we'll trim these pieces out to create those little scoops. So again, back to my S key, and we'll use our 3-point arc. And we'll get these placed in from one to the next, to there. And again, these are just 3-point arcs. So again, very easy to control, right? With our dimension tool, we can go right in here and start dimensioning these. If we want to do that, we could dimension any of this stuff very easily. Nothing, noodly or spliney about this. We can just set regular dimensions in here to get this done. All right, so wherever these need to go. Whoops, we've got a relation up there. Don't need that. I was wondering what happened. Okay, watch out for those auto relations. There we go. And now when you're dimensioning things like this, if you were to create these dimensions, don't forget about your shift key, right? So from one to the next, if you hold shift, you can alter which of the extremes of a curve you're getting. So we can set where if we just selected from here to here, you'll see that that's getting our center. If we hold shift, that now gives us our closest one. So that's a quick way that you can make those adjustments to your dimension tool when you're setting out dimensions like this. And don't forget that you can adjust this after the fact. If you do, make a misclick and you say, oh, that's not what I wanted that other arc condition, your leaders tab over here, you'll see your arc conditions at the bottom, and then you can make those adjustments. So I wanted actually the min or the max measurement for this certain curve. You can adjust that per selection that you made. So you can use these combinations of controls to get the actual dimension that you want after the fact if you forgot that key combination there. All right, but the shift key is a great shortcut. Okay, so we've got these in place. Again, we can do any of the adjustments that we need to make here. Let's pull this back where that's supposed to be, since we went dragging everything out of place with our mistaken auto relation here. Okay, and we need to then go in and cut this out with our trim tool. Now, if we cut this out, we're going to lose our whole reference of this entire piece here. So there's a couple ways you could go about doing this. You could put those three original arcs into another sketch and just kind of keep them for safekeeping. But if you don't mind this being broken up a little bit, one nice way to do this is to trim these out without actually taking the geometry out of there. So I'll use my S key and I'll grab the trim tool. And what I mean by that is this checkbox here, which is keep trimmed entities as construction geometry. So if I go in here and trim this now, you'll see that these entities stay. So you still get the reference there, but we've now just taken them out of the equation as far as the sketch is concerned, because they've now been converted into construction geometry. All right, if there's anything that you need to trim and have it totally gone, then you can uncheck that and it will totally remove it. So you've got two different modes to work with there. Okay, so now we've got this sort of complex shape where it sort of comes out and then comes to a point, arcs down, arcs back around, and then scallops its way out. But I'd really like this whole profile to be one big complex spline. Now, I don't want to have the hassle of trying to get that all marked in. And in fact, this would be a pretty tricky spline to get to work, because we've got, really tight sections down here. We've got several little tight sections in a row, and then big sweeping pieces as well. It's a whole lot easier to try to make this in simpler little bits of geometry. Now, to convert this, all we need to do is use the same methodology that we were thinking about when we were drawing our style spline and fit a spline to this geometry. And that's exactly the tool that we're going to use. So I'll use my S key again and we'll search for fit. And you'll see that fit spline is the tool that comes up. I'll say okay. And we can now select the entities that we want to group together. Now, as soon as I start selecting entities, you'll see that this is essentially stretching a rubber band across all of those entities, and it's fitting a curve, one continuous curve, to those entities. Now you see this in pink is a curve that it's creating, and you notice that it's creating a closed spline, which in this case is not what I want. So we're going to come over to the fit spline and say uncheck on closed spline, and this will now create just one single entity that doesn't close the loop back. So we can select the rest of our entities here all the way down. And in fact, you know what? Let me back up a section, because we're making some interesting rounds here. I'm going to do one more thing before we create that fit spline. So I hit escape to drop myself out of the fit spline, and I've just realized that when we get down to the bottom, we're going to have an issue here, because we need the fit spline to create these little radiuses. So it will essentially, as I said, kind of stretch a rubber band around the geometry that we have, which is great because that will auto create some radiuses for us. However, this is sharp at the bottom, and I want that to actually curl down here and continue that along. So what I'm going to do is trick the style spline a little bit, and I'm going to have this geometry pretend like it's going to keep right on going. So to do that, let's mirror this over. So I'm going to hit my S key and search for mirror entities. We're going to select this entity. I'm going to right click to index down, and I'm going to select this line right here, which will mirror about that line, right click to accept. And I'm going to include this little bit because that's the matching piece. So I want that arc to actually blend this as well, and then I'm gonna chop it back. So let's go back to our fit spline, and now we know that we're gonna create a continuous shape all the way down and through once we go mirror that. Let's try this again. So I'm gonna hit my S key again, we'll search for fit spline. And we'll do the same thing that we did before. Let's grab from the top all the way down. I'm gonna turn off my closed spline. And we'll select the bottom as well. Excuse me. Now, we can see that at the bottom here, we're getting a little indication as to what that radius is going to be. So it's giving us a little call out that says, at this tolerance setting, your radiuses in these regions are going to be set here. So it's giving us a little radius value. If we adjust this tolerance, you'll see that that radius changes. So we have some control over how stretchy, if you will, the rubber band is that will be blending this all together. So let's turn this back down a little bit, maybe somewhere around probably where it was good. And we'll leave that little curve that's going to stretch across there on all of those points. So we'll say, okay. So what we've done now is we've taken a rubber band of a spline, we've wrapped it around the geometry that we created with just simple entities. And this is now one continuous piece of geometry that you can see highlighted in orange as that goes all the way down and around. All right, now the only thing that we need to do is to remove this little extra section because that's how we got that nice little continuous curve right there. So I'm going to use my S key again. And we will take this piece out. We don't need that. So we'll cut that off. We will leave this little piece because I do actually need that little stub there. And then the last thing I'm going to do is just fix this for the time being to keep that where that needs to go. All right. So now we've got a continuous spline that's wrapped all the way up and around and is knocking off all of the corners, all of the sharp corners that we created in this geometry. All right, let's exit this sketch and let's see what we can do with these now that we've got these in place. So first things first, let's take the geometry that is this side geometry and let's create something actually useful. And I'm going to move over to my Surfaces tab to do this. Now, if your Surfaces tab is not showing, you can right click on the Command Manager tabs. Under tabs, you can turn this on and off, control which tabs are visible. I have my Surfaces tab turned on. Now, if you're not familiar with surfacing, that's okay. We're just going to use this as a simple reference right here. And in fact, we're going to use the easiest tool that you're already familiar with under the Surfacing tab. My next video, I'm actually going to cover some things over when you might want to switch into surfacing if you're not familiar with what surfacing can do for you, or when you might want to stay with solids. But for the moment, just stick with me. We're just going to use the surface as a reference and you'll see where this is going to go. So it's just kind of a marker for what this shape needs to be. All right, so in our surfacing tab, we're going to go over to our extruded surface. Now you'll notice, again, if you're not familiar with surfacing, that these first surfacing tools look strangely familiar, and that's because they are essentially identical to the features tab, right? All of these same tools, they just work on a surface level. So we're just creating one single face, if you want to think of it that way, with these tools rather than some solid geometry. So I'm going to extrude this surface, and I am going to select the spline that we created from our side profile. And in fact, I'm going to drag this off to the side. So we'll go for a blind distance, and the distance itself actually doesn't matter. The reason why it doesn't matter in this case is because we're going to trim this back out with the shape that we created for the top profile. So as long as it's further out than where this is, that's fine. You can set a blind value or you can lock it to this sketch in some way. Either is okay. As long as it goes out further than we need to have this sketch be, then that will work fine for our needs. So I will say okay to that. And you can see this creates that profile, but now in a 3D shape that's extruded out. Okay, now the next step is going to be to take this shape, which is now our spline and two lines, and trim out this shape with this shape. All right, so what we're gonna do is go to trim surface, which is exactly what it sounds like. We're gonna take a surface and cut it out with our scissors. And what the scissors shape is depends on a couple different options. So we've got a standard trim type and a mutual trim type. Mutual means you're trimming with another surface. Standard means you're trimming with some kind of trim tool. So we're gonna leave this on our standard trim, and our trim tool itself is going to be this guy, our sketch. So we're saying this is the punch that we're going to use to punch out our surface to the shape that we want it to be. So from here, we can choose to keep or remove selection. Either is fine. Whatever selection is the easiest, you can use those buttons. So we'll say keep selection. I want to keep this inside, get rid of the rest. All right, so I'll right click to accept. And there we have it. We're starting to get somewhere. So let's hide these sketches to get them out of the way, get our images out of the way here so we can see what we've just done. So we've got now a pretty complex shape that is a combination, or essentially a projection, of these two independent shapes that we created. Now, one of the benefits that you'll see here of using that fit spline in our previous geometry is you can see this is now one continuous edge as it goes down through. You may have been asking, why bother, wrap this with a fit spline when we could have just used those arcs and strung them together and that would have worked just fine. It will, right? Then you would just have to fillet these corners off and you can work that way as well. But if you're looking for a little bit cleaner geometry where you've got one continuous edge, fit spline is a great way to do that. So now that we've got this in place, and again, we ensured our tangency up here, we ensured our tangency down here, we can mirror this over and we will have one full complete board. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. I'll use my S key and grab mirror. Again, that's on the features tab if you want to get it from there. And from here, we can select our planes to mirror about. So we'll grab our right plane, our secondary plane. I'm going to do this all in one operation here, is going to be our front plane. And the bodies that I'm going to select, in this case, it's got to be a body because we're using our surface here, is this guy. All right, we can knit our surfaces, which means stitch them together. And we'll say, okay. And there we have it, our overly exaggerated snowboard. So if we look from this side, we see we've got that gull wing shape across the whole board. If we look from the top side, we see we have the profile that we just generated. And if we look from an isometric view, we've got a combination of those two shapes, right? Where that scalloped shape now follows that gull wing shape up and around and wherever that needs to go to get to where it needs to go. Okay, and this shape is totally dependent on the two of those shapes together. So if we wanted to reduce the flex in this, we could go back and edit this, this sketch. We could bring this down a little bit. All right, whatever this shape is, whatever this curve is, that's what that projection is going to be. Right, we've now flattened the board out. So again, it's really about the techniques of combining those two shapes by using a surface reference and trimming it back to be able to project those shapes together and get what you're after in the end. Sorry to interrupt. Jesse from the future here. I realized as I'm editing this that I didn't do a great job of explaining why this particular method might be a good fit for this geometry. Now, I'm not going to add 15 minutes to this video, so I will post a follow-up video with more information if you need that. But for the sake of this video, let's take a look back at the geometry itself. So this geometry, I've kind of overlaid them again, just sort of vertically here. But this geometry for the base is pretty flat, and I've obviously exaggerated this quite a bit for the sake of example in this video, but a snowboard is pretty flat. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a projection method, which means that we're taking this shape and projecting it down onto this one. And if this has some really steep shapes in it, that could be problematic. In this case, not the case, which is why I think it's a good approximation of this geometry. But for example, if these curves fell on geometry down here that was very steep, you could see how this shape is going to get stretched and deformed across that topology at the bottom. So again, a good fit because this is relatively flat. That will let this geometry project down pretty close onto the geometry itself, and that's why we're using this method for this particular geometry. Okay, last step. Lastly, if we want to add some geometry to this, we could quickly thicken this if it's a consistent thickness, or we could do this again if it's not a consistent thickness and stack the two. So let's say this is maybe 5 millimeters. Okay. And now we have solid geometry. Well, just like most things in modeling, it's just a matter of taking simpler pieces and putting them back together again. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy and honestly pretty enjoyable. Just like a quiet night at the mountain. So, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next one. Man, it is chilly tonight.